Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at the formal criminal justice system. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to be learning about the steps in the formal criminal justice system. All the steps that the offender takes as they work their way through the criminal justice system. But as you learn in your textbook that very few offenders go through each of the steps in the formal criminal justice system. So the next lecture, we're going to be learning about why that is. We're going to be learning about this thing called the criminal justice funnel and the factors that cause the winnowing effect, the factors that contribute to the reason why most offenders don't go through all of the steps. But in this lecture, you're going to learn about all of those steps and the formal criminal justice system. So let's get started. All right, so when we talk about the criminal justice system, which I will oftentimes refer to as the CGS in written material during the course of the semester, but not always, what is the criminal justice system? What is included in it? And so one way of thinking about the criminal justice system is to think about it in terms of two elements. On the one hand, you can think about the criminal justice system as the stages through which the offender passes. And we're going to be talking about those four stages of the criminal justice system in today's lecture. The police procedure, stage 1, the prosecutorial stage, stage 2, trial stage, etc. And so there are certain stages that include a number of steps that contribute to the overall process of the criminal justice system. Another way of thinking about the criminal justice system, and I mean, this isn't an either or, it's a both and, right? They are both stages. The criminal justice system is both stages and it is agencies. And so the criminal justice system is made up of governmental agencies. And each of those governmental agencies are charged with enforcing the law at each of those stages and at each point within those stages. And so law enforcement, okay, we'll be learning about law enforcement, this semester, but those who work for law enforcement are governmental agents. They're governmental actors. I mean, we know that. They're part of the executive branch. So whether that's local law enforcement like the Milwaukee Police Department or law enforcement that works for the Sheriff's Office, which are county, or FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is federal law enforcement, all of those are agencies that make up the criminal justice system. The office of the prosecutor. And so you'll see one of the stages is dedicated to the prosecutorial stage. And so there is a lawyer who works for the state. They're known as the prosecutor. Oftentimes they're referred to as the district attorney at the state level. U.S. attorneys are prosecutors for the federal system. And those are governmental agents who work, again, for the Department of Justice, which is a part of the federal executive branch. The court system. Later at the end of this semester, you're actually going to go and be visiting a court, sitting in on a courtroom. And, obviously a lot of the activities within the criminal justice system take place within the courts. Whether that is a preliminary hearing to determine whether or not somebody should be charged with the crime, the arraignment, which you'll be learning about in a moment, the trial itself, the sentencing, all of that takes place within the court system. And then finally, the correctional agencies, jails, prisons, state prisons, federal penitentiaries, all of that makes up, governmental agencies, again, part of the executive branch, that is a part and parcel of this overall criminal justice system. Okay, so the criminal justice system is comprised of stages. It's also comprised of agencies and people who work as governmental agents within the criminal justice system. But the criminal justice system is also a process, and that's what we're going to be learning about in this lecture, the formal process of the criminal justice system. And so the process is basically takes an offender through a series of decision points. And that's what we'll be focusing on in this lecture, because key decisions are made at each point within the overall process. And so as you'll see in a moment, in the police procedures stage, Key decisions are made about whether or not you should have initial contact with somebody, whether or not you should arrest somebody, whether or not that person, once arrested, should actually be taken into police custody. All of those are key decision points. Now, oftentimes when we learn about the formal criminal justice process, we sort of think about it as an assembly line, right? So if you've ever worked in an assembly line, right, one person does one thing and they pass it on to the next person, then they pass it on to the next person, pass it on to the next person, right? It's an assembly line. And then at the end, you have the final product. So when you learn about the formal criminal justice process, you're sort of learning about the assembly line. And it's sometimes referred to as the criminal justice assembly line. There's decisions that are made, they pass it on to the next decision maker, the next decision maker, and the next decision maker. But as we'll learn in the second lecture, and as you're learning in your textbook this week, very few people go through all of the steps, right? Very few offenders or people make it, go through every point of that assembly line. In fact, the vast majority of people don't go through each of the decision points. We'll be learning about in the next lecture about the criminal justice funnel. For all of the crimes that are committed in the United States, very few of those crimes about half of those crimes are actually reported to law enforcement. Of those, very few or, even less are, where you actually identify a perpetrator, even less are charged, etc. And so, funnels, they're big at the top and small at the bottom. And that's because, those offenders, many don't make it through all of those steps. And in the next lecture, we're going to be looking about the reasons and the factors that contribute to that winnowing or the funneling of the criminal justice system. And so we'll be learning about the courtroom work group and the criminal justice wedding cake. And so keep those in mind. We'll learn more about them in the next lecture, but keep those in mind as we're learning about all of the steps, the formal criminal justice process. Now, when I teach this class in a face-to-face environment, we oftentimes will look at this great TV series or clips from this great TV series from HBO called The Night Of. But since this is an online class, it's difficult for me to show clips of an HBO series because I can't transform it into videos and put it on YouTube because it always gets dinged for, copyright violation, as it should. And so instead, since I can't show the clips, I'll tell you a little bit about the series. And that the reason I use this series is because it does a really good job of doing a fairly accurate portrayal of the criminal justice process that we're going to be learning about today. And so, I don't know if you've seen The Night Of. If you haven't seen it, it's great. I've got some characters here from The Night Of, and let me just tell you a little bit about what happens in that show. The Night Of is based on this young man. His name in the show is Nazir Khan, and he's played by Riz Ahmed, who you might be familiar with. He's made several movies. And, Nazir Khan is a college student, lives in a pretty sheltered community. Even though he's a college student, he still lives at home with his mom and his dad and his brother. He's Pakistani American. He's born in the United States, but he lives in a Pakistani community within New York City. And he lives a pretty sheltered life, and he's pretty sick about, he's tired of living the sheltered life. So one day he gets invited to a party, a party in Manhattan. And he wants to go to it because he wants to live a more exciting life. But his ride falls through, and he doesn't have a way of getting into Manhattan. He lives in Queens. And so he decides to borrow his dad's taxi cab. His dad is a taxi cab driver. He doesn't really know how to drive he knows how to drive a car, but he's not a taxi cab driver. He takes the taxi and he goes to Manhattan looking for the party. Well, he gets lost and he can't find the party. And because he's in a taxi cab, people keep hailing the taxi cab and they want to get a ride from him. And then at one point, this young woman here, her name's Andrea Cornish, she gets into his taxi cab and she's really attractive. She's, as you can see there, sort of dressed in a sexy manner. And Nazir decides to go back to her apartment with her. She invites him back to her apartment because he's looking for some fun and excitement. Well, things don't go well at the apartment. They start doing drugs, and he doesn't take a lot of drugs. He doesn't do a lot of drinking, and she's pretty wild. And they start playing these sorts of dangerous games. They have a knife, and they start, playing this game where you try to like put it between your fingers and not cut yourself. So, this is going to be a wild night. And then they make their way upstairs, have sex, and Nazir Khan passes out. You can kind of see where this is going. He wakes up the next morning and he's getting ready to leave. He had somehow made his way downstairs. And then he decides he wants to go upstairs and say goodbye to Andrea. So he goes upstairs to say goodbye. It's in the dark in her bedroom. It's very early in the morning. And he's saying goodbye. He's getting his things and he turns on the light and Andrea Cornish is stabbed to death. She is covered with blood. And that he freaks out, he leaves the apartment, and then he ultimately gets pulled over for drunk driving by police, which we'll talk about in police procedures in a moment. And the show is basically about what happens to Nazir Khan. He gets charged with first-degree intentional homicide. Bail is set at no bail. He cannot be, he can't make, there's no bail because he's seen as being a real threat to society because of the heinousness of the crime. And he gets he pays for a lawyer, John Turturro, who is here, who's maybe not the best lawyer. And then he's countered with Helen Weiss. She's the prosecuting attorney for the city of Manhattan. And then this is Detective Box, a hard-boiled detective who's out to make sure that Nazir Khan is found guilty. So the show is just a fascinating look at the criminal justice system, and from what everything I've read, it actually does a pretty good job with an accurate representation for it. So if you haven't seen it, I recommend watching it because it really brings to life a lot of things that we're going to be talking about. But I'll try to make reference to the specific scenes in the series as we're going forward and taking a look at each of these steps. Okay, so before we take a look at each of the individual stages within the criminal justice process, I want to let me put the 4 stages up there, and then we'll look at the particular steps within these stages. Now, you'll want to be taking notes during this lecture if you aren't already. Of course, you can always go back and rewind it and look at the notes, on the slides that I'm making here. And the reason you want to take notes is because, as I'll talk about at the end of this lecture, there's an extra credit opportunity for you to put the steps in the different stages of the criminal justice system in order. And then you can earn some extra credit points for doing that. So let's take a look at the 4 stages. So stage 1 is police procedures. Stage 2 is the prosecutorial stage. Stage 3 is the trial stage. And stage 4 is correctional procedures. And so in the remaining slides, we're going to take a look at the individual steps within each of these stages, and we'll start with the police procedures. All right, so let's start with stage 1, police procedures. As the title suggests, this stage is all about policing. And policing is really an important stage within the criminal justice process because police are really the gatekeepers of the formal criminal justice process. When a crime is committed and it's never reported to police, and as I stated, many crimes are never even reported to the police, then that crime will never get into the process because police don't even know about it. But once police even know about a potential criminal act, they make choices and decisions about what to do next in terms of, when they come across and have an initial contact with somebody, they make key decisions that determine whether or not that individual, enters into the criminal justice process or whether or not they do not. And we allow law enforcement, we'll be learning more about this as the semester goes on. I mean, we go into each of these stages in a lot more depth as we continue throughout the course of the semester. But we give police a lot of discretion, that we allow police to make professional judgments in order to decide what to do when they come across a crime and a potential offender. And there's a lot to be said about the importance of that, giving police that discretion. On the one hand, you want them to use their professional judgment, because you don't want people brought into the criminal justice process if there's no need for them to have that sort of contact. But on the other hand, that we want them to use their professional judgment so they can differentiate between something, an event that is needing of criminal justice contact and the kind of event that is not. Okay. And so, the police procedures are, is really the gateway into the criminal justice process. Let me put up each of the steps within the stage. And so we've got initial contact. Second step is investigation. Third step is arrest. And the fourth step is bringing that person into police custody. And let's talk about these each individually. All right. So we got a picture there from the night of, and that's Nazir Khan. And after he leaves Andre Cornish's apartment, finding out that she is, stabbed to death, he totally freaks out. He doesn't have any memory of anything that happened that night. And he jumps into his dad's cab and he speeds away because he wants to get away from the crime scene as quickly as possible. But he's been partying all night and he's drunk as a skunk. So it's very early in the morning and he makes an erratic turn. And that he then, wouldn't you know, law enforcement is right there in their car and they pull him over. And that's basically the initial contact in this instance that takes place in the night of. They pull him over and then that's the first contact that law enforcement have with Nazir Khan. Now you'll read in your textbook, there's a lot of different types of initial contact. Initial contact could be an observation, in this case, a reckless driver. The initial contact could be victim contact, that if you're a victim of a crime, you call police and say, I've just been robbed, or, my house has just been broken into. That can be an initial contact. An initial contact can be an informant, somebody that's working with law enforcement, etc. So there's a lot of different ways that law enforcement have that initial contact. After they make that initial contact, then they'll engage in a quick an investigation. Okay. Now, in the case of Nazir Khan, it was a pretty quick investigation. That they saw that he was driving recklessly, but there's a lot of times why somebody might make a wrong turn that would have nothing to do with a crime, or that there's no reason to actually arrest or give this person a ticket. You could be confused late at night, don't know where you're going, might be in a rental vehicle, whatever. But the investigation for Nazir Khan was he unrolls his window. They ask him to unroll his window, and just all of this smell of alcohol comes wafting out of the car. And at that point, that they are like, our investigation is leading to the fact that there's a drunk driving. Get him out of the car. They give him breathalyzer, and it's clear that that this is a drunk driving. So that's a good example of a relatively, quick investigation to determine whether or not there's a drunk driving incident that's going on. But as you'll read in your textbook, that investigation can be a quick investigation like that. But it can also, it can go from a few minutes to a month. As we're sort of seeing with the investigation of individuals who were involved in the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, federal agents and have been investigating the activities of the people who are at the Capitol for a long period of time, since January for over a year. And so sometimes an investigation based on a crime can take quite a period of time. Now, after the investigation, the decision will be made about whether or not this individual should be arrested. A lot of times based on if you're drunk driving, they're going to be put in cuffs and you're going to be brought into police custody, right? You'll be arrested and then your liberty will be taken away and you'll be brought into custody of the police and you'll be brought down to the police station. Just because you're arrested doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be taken into custody. That arrest needs to be based on probable cause, and a lot of times sometimes somebody might initially arrest somebody, but then they'll decide to let that person go because there doesn't seem to be enough, a reason to bring that person into custody. They might give that person a ticket and then let them go, but not take them into actual custody. In the case of Nazir Khan, it was interesting that while they were doing the investigation, the law enforcement, the cops got a call on their radio, and the call was reporting the death of Andrea Cornish that had taken place. And so that the cops realized that they had bigger fish to fry, and they didn't really know what to do with Nazir Khan. And so at that moment, they said, hey, we should just let him go, right? I mean, it's like, we'll give him a ticket and let him be on his merry way. But then the other cop didn't feel good about that because he was drunk. They said, look, let's just put him in the back of the car. We'll go investigate this other crime scene, this more significant crime scene, and then we'll figure out what to do with Nazir Khan later. He ultimately does get arrested and placed in custody. Once they bring him back to the police station, they pat him down, and then they realize that he has a knife, and what do you know? It's the bloody knife, and at that point that he is arrested and put into custody. And so it doesn't turn out well for Nazir Khan in the police stage. The next stage in the criminal justice process is the prosecutorial stage, stage 2. And the picture there from the night of is Helen Weiss. She's an assistant district attorney for Manhattan. And the case with Nazir Khan has been put on her plate, and she is the one who's deciding whether to charge this individual with a crime and which crime they're going to charge Nazir Khan with. And so the prosecutorial stage revolves around the prosecutor. And as I mentioned before, there are lots of different types of prosecutors. In Wisconsin, our prosecutors at the state level are called district attorneys. And so if you live in Milwaukee, John Chisholm is our district attorney. Is getting a lot of heat recently because his office was involved in the individual who drove into the Christmas parade in Waukesha, that he was out on bail, and that was a decision that his office made. So you might be familiar with John Chisholm because he's been in the news recently. The prosecutor is responsible for, in this stage, determining many different things. So let's take a look at the different steps within the process in the prosecutorial stage. Charging is the first step. Preliminary hearing, grand jury is the second. Arraignment is third. Bail and detention is the fourth, and then the fifth is plea bargaining. So let's talk about each of these steps within the prosecutorial stage. It's up to the prosecutor, once law enforcement arrests somebody and take that person into custody. It's up to the prosecutor, to the district attorney, to decide whether or not this person should actually be charged with a crime. You're going to be learning this semester that just because somebody is arrested and brought into custody doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be charged with a crime. Oftentimes, a prosecutor will look at the facts of the case and they will say, look, that if we have enough evidence to maybe charge this person with the crime, but not enough evidence to get a conviction if this case actually goes to trial. And so sometimes a prosecutor will take a pass, and that they'll exercise what's called nolli prosequi. That is that term there. It's a Latin term that means that they're unwilling to pursue this case. And so the first decision point is the prosecutor's decision if they want to charge this individual with a crime. In the case of Nazir Khan, there was really no decision to make. The prosecutor charged Nazir Khan with first-degree intentional homicide. The second step is the check on the charge. And so the prosecutor has a lot of power that they can, they're charging somebody with a crime. Well, we live in a democracy. So in a democracy, you want to make sure that there's other entities that are making sure that there's probable cause to sustain that charge. Okay. And that's what happens in that second step. The preliminary hearing is basically a hearing where the prosecutor comes to the court and then they tell the judge that this is what they want to charge an individual with. The defense attorney will be there and they will say that there's not enough probable cause to sustain that charge. And then the judge will determine as a result of that hearing whether or not there is probable cause and whether or not a charge should be levied. The grand jury is similar. It's also a check on the power of the prosecutor, but rather than having a court hearing, you actually have a grand jury, a group of individuals who come to court, and then the prosecutor will give the individuals evidence to look at to decide whether or not there's probable cause. And if there is, that individual will be indicted. Don't worry if you are, they'll talk about it in the textbook, but we'll go into a lot more detail later in the semester. But the most important point is that second preliminary hearing in grand jury is a check on the charge. It basically provides a check on the power of the prosecutor. If there's probable cause to charge somebody, then the individual is arraigned. And the arraignment is where the individual is brought into court and they are told what they're being charged with. You have a constitutional right to have the charges are read to you. There's a determination about whether you understand the charges. And then you are informed of your rights because you are being charged with a crime. And then you will enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. That's what happens in the arraignment. And the night of, it's kind of a funny scene because Nazir Khan they gave him a Harvard sweatshirt while he's waiting in custody. And he's brought into the arraignment wearing this Harvard sweatshirt, and he looks like a meek individual. And when they arraign him and that they announce that he's being charged with first-degree intentional homicide, all the other people in the courtroom were like, what? Like he didn't look like he was a murderer, whatever a murderer looks like. But that's what the arraignment is. It's that moment to inform that individual of the charges, and then they will enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. If you are plead not guilty, then you will that if you enter a plea of not guilty, then a determination will be made about what happens to you then. That if you plead not guilty, then you are bound over for trial because a trial is going to take place because you said not guilty. And then a determination is made about whether or not bail is going to be set. And if you're not able to make that bail, then you will be detained, you will be held in jail until that trial takes place. So that's, a product of the arraignment. And then finally, even though a person pleads not guilty, that they may change their mind and that there's a plea bargaining that takes place. A plea bargaining, and again, we'll be learning more about this during the course of the semester, is basically a discussion between the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney. And they will try to come up with a compromise to say, look, my client pled not guilty, but they're willing to plead guilty if you reduced the charges. And that's what happened in the night of, that his defense attorney was able to plead down to manslaughter with the promise of a minimum of 10 years in prison. And that's, as a good example when you watch it in the TV series of a plea bargaining agreement. So again, charging, preliminary hearing, arraignment, bail detention, and plea bargaining. Those are the steps within the prosecutorial stage. Okay, so the third stage is the trial stage. And even though Nazir Khan enters into a plea agreement, I won't give you any spoilers, but it turns out that he ultimately does end up going to trial. And that is his attorney, played by John Turturro, who is representing Nazir Khan at this trial. You can see all the evidence around there, a bloody lampshade. Let's take a look at the steps in the trial stage. First step is the trial. The second step is sentencing. And then the third step is the appeals process. Won't spend a lot of time on these steps, just because I don't want the video to go on too long. But if you want to exercise your right to go to trial, which many people do, but not, vast majority of people engage in a plea bargain. And so, about 90% of people plead guilty and only about 10% end up going to trial. That the trial can be held either before a judge or a jury. That you have a choice to have a bench a trial, and it's the trial where testimony will be presented, evidence will be presented, and then an ultimate determination of whether or not the individual is guilty or whether the individual is found not guilty, a verdict will be delivered as a product of the trial. If the individual is found not guilty, stops there, okay? If you are found not guilty in a jury trial, then you step out of the process and you don't go through any additional stages. If you are found guilty, then you will be sentenced, and that takes place at the trial stage. Sentencing can range from a fine all the way to the death penalty, and so that is, you'll be learning more about the sentencing process. And then if you are found guilty, then you have the right to appeal your conviction, okay? It takes place after, it's post-conviction, and that basically you'll say, look, I was found guilty, but there were problems, there were errors in my trial. That you could say that there was a lack of fairness, that the jury seemed to be biased. You could say that your rights were violated, that evidence was submitted that was illegally obtained, etc. The state cannot appeal a not guilty verdict. The appeal is to make sure that the criminally accused, that we have confidence that in fact if they are found guilty, that there were no errors in the trial. So the stages are trial, sentencing, and then the appeals. Those are the three steps in the trial stage. Okay, and so the last stage is stage 4, the correctional procedures. And one of the really chilling aspects of the night of is it shows the dehumanizing impact that confinement in a correctional facility can have on an individual. As you'll see there, this person, let me put on the magic pen, the person here might seem familiar to you if you've watched the other great HBO series by David Simon, The Wire. That's the individual actor. He just recently died, which was a real loss. Michael Kenneth Williams, who played Omar in the outstanding series The Wire. Williams is also in The Night of, and he plays this pretty brutal killer whose name is Freddie Knight. And he is being held at Rikers Island as he's working his way through a series of potential convictions, although he has been convicted of a crime as well. Nazir Khan also, because he is being held over, and there's no bail is not set because he's seen as such a danger, that he spends his time waiting trial in Rikers Island. And if you know anything about Rikers Island, it's a jail compound in New York City. It's one of the most violent places really in the United States in terms of a correctional facility. And one of the chilling aspects of the night of is just how Nazir Khan gets transformed into this brutal, hard convict, even though you can watch the show to see how it turns out. But Rikers Island has this horrible effect on Nazir Khan, and the show does a good job of sort of demonstrating that. And so there are 3 steps in the correctional procedure stage: the correctional treatment, and so once you're sentenced, you may be sentenced to confinement. And so that you would be confined if it's a short sentence, in jail, a longer sentence in prison. And that the correctional treatment can be anywhere from secure confinement, but also probation as a part of that correctional treatment as well. One is released back into society, and there's oftentimes post-release care that goes on. The post-release is parole, can make sure that you are living up to the conditions of your release. And again, we'll go into more detail as the semester goes on. So 3 steps: correctional treatment, release, and post-release. Okay, so that's it of taking a look at the 4 stages within the criminal justice system. Again, make sure you read the textbook. It goes into a lot more detail, and this is a lot of what you're going to be learning about over the course of the semester. Now, as I said, there's an extra credit opportunity for you to take a quiz this week, and it gives you the opportunity to test yourself of the steps of the criminal justice process that we just talked about. It's a drop and drag quiz, and so for each stage, you'll see the 4 stages, and in each of the stages, the different steps will be there in out of order, and then you drag and drop those into the correct order. Just because you're testing yourself, you only have 5 minutes to take the quiz, although I think you can take it multiple times. Don't use your notes and don't use your textbook. Really try to test yourself. And anybody who completes the quiz, even if you take multiple attempts, will get 5 extra credit points for correctly putting it in order. You've got to put it in order correctly. And the first 5 students that do it with the least amount of time and the least amount of attempts will earn an additional 5 extra credit points for a total of 10 points. All right, so I hope you take the quiz. It's a lot of fun, and thanks for listening. And I'll talk to you again in a moment in lecture number 2.